Well, hello, hello. Wonderful to have you here. What I want to discuss today is aging. Aging in the Buddha Dharma. In particular, the Buddha's own experiences with aging as reflected in some of the early texts. But before I get to what the Buddha's own experiences were with aging that we can find reflected in those texts, I want to talk a little bit about the role of aging in the Dharma. Because aging, growing old, is a central part of what's called dukkha, or sometimes translated suffering. The first noble truth is the truth of dukkha, or suffering. And in that first noble truth we read, "Now this is the noble truth of dukkha. Birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, illness is dukkha, death is dukkha. Union with what is displeasing is dukkha. Separation from what is pleasing is dukkha. Not to get what one wants is dukkha. In brief, the five aggregates subject to clinging are dukkha." Now there's a lot here in this statement about the First Noble Truth, and I've discussed a lot of that in a separate video. I'm not going to go into all of it here. I'll leave a link to that video down below in the notes. But what I want to reflect upon here is the role of old age, of aging. That it is simply a part of life. It's not something that we can escape. Indeed, the aging in general is not something we can escape. Old age is something, yeah, we can escape it, but, it's not a good idea to escape it. There's the sort of dark humor of, you think old age is bad, well, the alternative is worse, right? So it's something that we all have to face if we're lucky enough to actually get there. So aging, old age are simply necessary parts of life, and if we're going to, as many teachers and wise people suggest, if they suggest that we embrace life. Well, if we're going to embrace life, then we're also going to have to embrace old age, since old age just is a central part of life, again, if we're lucky enough to get there. What we tend to do, on the other hand, is rather to embrace youth and to indulge in what the Buddha terms the vanity of youth. This idea that many of us have, I think we'll know about it from our own experience or experience of those around us, that youth is everlasting, that we are immortal, that we're never going to grow old. This kind of clinging to and indulging in a kind of a vanity of youthfulness. And the Buddha himself talks about how he indulged in that very vanity, and it produced in him a certain kind of thought. In other words, he thought about it, he considered it, and he has something to say about it. Indeed, in one of the early texts, this is what he says, reflecting on his own youth. He says, "When an uneducated ordinary person who is liable to grow old, not being exempt from old age, sees someone else who is old, they're horrified, repelled, and disgusted, overlooking the fact that they themselves are in the same situation. But since I, too, am liable to grow old, it would not be appropriate for me to be horrified, embarrassed, and disgusted when I see someone else who is old. Reflecting like this, I entirely gave up the vanity of youth." In other words, what the Buddha is saying here is that when he was younger, he indulged in this kind of vanity, which involved a kind of a reaction against, a repulsion from old age. And this, again, seems to be, I think, a normal feature of lives of many young people. And it is indeed rejecting part of our own very lives, because we ourselves are going to experience that if we're lucky enough to get there. So the young Gautama, the young Buddha, the Buddha before he was the Buddha, seems to have been quite wise and quite thoughtful. But what about when the Buddha grew older? What about when he actually engaged with old age? What was it like then? Now, what I think are one of the hallmarks of the authenticity of the early texts are that they record the bodily failings of the Buddha as he grew older. When we look to texts that are later, much later, from later traditions, we find more what I would term a hagiography of the Buddha, of picturing the Buddha, describing the Buddha as a deified or nearly deified being, a being that never truly suffered, a being that never truly engaged with things like old age because he was perfected. However, when we look at those early texts, we find a very different picture, a picture that is more in line with what we might term normal real life. Now, hagiographic texts are ones that we would more expect to have been composed by the Buddha's devoted followers in the years, decades, and centuries after his lifetime. I'll return to some of this point later on in the video. But in any event, we may consider that it's somewhat dangerous to think of the Buddha as having experienced suffering. It's somewhat dangerous for us to think of the Buddha as having really experienced some of the issues involved in old age. We may think to ourselves that even if I become enlightened, I'm still going to experience old age. And the answer to that is yes, you will. The Buddha himself did. Later on in life, the Buddha seems to have had a bad back. On a number of different occasions, the suttas reflect that he was going to give a Dharma talk, but had to stop and retire so that he could lie down and stretch out his back, which was hurting him, and he had to have one of his attendants or monastic disciples give the talk in his place. In one early sutta, the Buddha is with his close attendant Ānanda, and Ānanda is giving him a massage. And Ānanda says to him, what Ānanda begins by saying is, "It's incredible, sir, it's amazing." And when we read those first few words, what might come to mind is that Ānanda is going to give us some sort of hagiographic description. He's going to say something like, "It's incredible, sir. It's amazing how vibrant and youthful you are, even though you are so old. You know, that you haven't changed a day in 80 years," or something like that. That's what we would expect from a later text. But indeed, if we keep reading, we'll find that Ānanda has something very, very different to say in this text. What Ānanda says is this: "It's incredible, sir, it's amazing how the complexion of your skin is no longer pure and bright. Your limbs are flaccid and wrinkled, and your body is stooped. And it's apparent that there has been a deterioration in your faculties of eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body." And the Buddha agrees with Ānanda's statement. He says that's how it is, Ānanda, that everyone is going to experience this kind of deterioration in old age. This sort of deterioration in old age is completely normal. And yet, one interesting feature of this passage is that the commentary is being given by later Buddhist monastics, trying to explain what these texts meant to them and so to enable us to understand them better. The commentaries also seem to have had trouble with this particular passage. Bhikkhu Bodhi, who did the translation of this, who's a very great translator and scholar of this early material, notes that in these commentaries, they repeatedly remark that all these changes were not evident to others, but only to Ānanda. And indeed, here we can see exactly how hagiography starts, with the apparent falsification of the very things we're reading in the early texts. We're reading a commentator saying, well, this really isn't apparent. It's only one person who could see it. Nobody else could have. And I think this is kind of a sad, even a kind of a desperate comment on this passage, because it seems to me, anyhow, from my experience, it seems to falsify the message that the Buddha is giving. This message that literally everybody is going to experience these very features of the First Noble Truth: old age, sickness, death, so that even the Buddha himself will experience them. And indeed, if we go on in that very same text, the Buddha has more to say on this very matter. The Buddha gives a verse, a couple of verses about his feelings, his experience of old age. He says this: "Curse this wretched old age which makes you so ugly. That's how much this delightful puppet is ground down by old age. Even if you live for 100 years, you'll still end up dying. Death spares no one, but crushes all underfoot." Now, I don't think that this passage reflects somebody who is entirely at ease with aging. Rather, it's a very human response, a wonderfully human response to the dukkha, the suffering that is involved with growing old. There are some passages where the Buddha is supposed to have said that he could have lived for a very, very long time. But in this passage, that doesn't seem to be on the table. The Buddha is saying that even if you live to 100 years, which for the Buddha in this passage seems to have been a very, very long period of time, even for him, he says even if you live for 100 years, you're still going to die. That this kind of old age is really a problem. And indeed, in another early text, which is indeed, we find it in a couple of places in the suttas, but one of these places is in the last sutta that records the last few months of the Buddha's life. He gives a separate description of what it's like to grow old for him. He had this to say to his close attendant Ānanda again. He says, he laments, he says, "I'm now old, elderly, and senior. I'm advanced in years and have reached the final stage of life. I'm currently 80 years old. Just as a decrepit cart keeps going by relying on straps, in the same way the Tathagata's body keeps going by relying on straps, or so you'd think." I think this is a very interesting and revealing simile here. He's saying basically that his body is sort of like duct taped together like some old hoopty, basically. And what the Buddha goes on to say, he goes on to describe how he deals with this situation on a regular day-to-day basis. What the Buddha says is this: "Sometimes the Tathagata, not focusing on any signs and with the cessation of certain feelings, enters and remains in the signless immersion of the heart. Only then does the Tathagata's body become more comfortable." So this phrase, the signless immersion of the heart, is Bhante Sujato's translation of the Pali phrase animita citta samadhi, which is an obscure state of deep meditative absorption. Precisely what state that is need not detain us right here. The point is clear, which is that the Buddha is in a state of more or less constant pain when he's getting old, when he's growing old, and that his only reliable exit from that pain is to get into a deep state of meditative absorption, one in which he leaves any kind of experience of the body behind. This is a formless meditation, a meditation that's not involved in the body, but that is pleasant in its own way, extremely pleasant, and so he can remain in that state and have a pleasant abiding where he is right there and right now. So the early texts give a pretty detailed picture of the life of the Buddha, of his old age in particular. We get the picture of a man wrinkled, stooped, in pain at least much of the time, his eyes and ears and senses failing, his body relying on straps to continue going. A person who spends much of his time in deep meditation in order to have an ease of life, an easier life, in order to get away from some of the pains, let's say back pain, that he was undergoing on a regular basis. None of this, I think, reflects a picture of a deified or perfected being, at least in regards of his body. Instead, what we have is a being, a very human being, undergoing the normal, natural progress of old age. One that we can all identify with, one that we can all look to for some inspiration and solace in the way that he deals with these problems. And indeed, if you want to know more about some of the meditative states that are involved that the Buddha discusses, or at least related meditative states that can illuminate what this animita cetu samadhi might have been. I have an earlier video on that very subject, dealing with some of these formless meditative states, and I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or would like to refresh your memory. So thanks so much for watching, and if you're getting something out of these videos, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked down below in the notes and here on the screen. See if you want to help support the channel and the work that we're all doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next one, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.